All right, now it's Friday, May the 6th, 2022. We are doing an interview with George Abbott. Okay, George, let's start with early life.
Early life. I was born and raised in Vermont. Ended up going to school in Vermont for the University of Vermont, which was a land-grant college, which means you had to go into the Army ROTC. And as a consequence, I was in that for the first semester. Did not like the upperclassmen that ran the programs. Being a little impetuous, I said I need an alternative. And the alternative was either to join the Navy Reserves, which was there in Burlington, Vermont, or drop out of school and get drafted. So I went in the reserves. Then I went to boot camp that following June for 2 weeks out at the Great Lakes Naval Training Center. Came back, and my commanding officer at the reserve unit wanted me to join the ROC program, which is essentially like an OCS program, but you go 2 summers for 8 weeks. And so I did that between my sophomore and junior year and between my junior and senior year. And that was in Newport, Rhode Island. Quite an experience, I will say that.
And why is that?
Well, Newport, Rhode Island is quite a Navy town, and you know, the first year we were there, we only got off base the last weekend we were there, so it was a little wild. And then as upperclassmen, the second summer we were there, we got off every weekend if you wanted to. And my one remembrance down there was a place called Leo's Last Stop, which was a waterfront bar, and I had just started learning how to drink, and so I parked my car on what I thought was a place to park. It was kind of a graduated loading ramp, if you will, for right beside the ocean. And I proceeded to have a few drinks and tell stories and do things, and came out and my car was gone. So I kind of walked around looking for it, and I looked over the edge of the pier, and there's my taillight sticking up. So that was my introduction to how do you get a car out of the water when you're in the Navy. And fortunately there was a Navy barge out on the dredging barge out there, so I kind of flagged them down and get the guy that was running the barge to hook onto my car and pull it out and set it on the pier for me. Then I had to get it to a place where I could get all the fish and crap out of it, so that's why I say it was a little interesting down there. But it was a good experience. We graduated from down there and then came back to the university, finished up my senior year, got married that January of my senior year, and then got my commission in May of 1967. And I had applied for salvage diving school, and I got my orders to Key West, Florida, which was an underwater swim school, and I thought, wow, this is good. Turns out they had me in EOD, not in salvage diving, so we went through all that program, and then ended
You
up
want to explain EOD?
Explosive Ordnance Disposal School. And so we went through 8.5 weeks of training down in Key West, Florida, and then went to Fort McClellan in Alabama to do a chemical and biological warfare school, and then off to Indian Head, Maryland for the EOD part of it. And then when I get out of there, because now I'm trained, at least partially trained as EOD, and they sent me to a destroyer with the 7th Fleet, which was based then in Subic Bay. And so that was just before Thanksgiving, I think, when I got my orders, and I drove out to California with my wife and got a place to stay, a little cheap hotel for a little while, and then we found an apartment in Chula Vista. And then we had Thanksgiving Day on the beach eating homemade turkey sandwiches, so that was a kind of introduction to Navy life. And then I had to fly out of Oakland, California on, I think it was the 4th of December, so we drove up there and I got on the plane, and you know, it was a SeaWorld Airlines, which was, you know, kind of like a DC-8 with a lot more seats in it than you normally have. So there was absolutely no room for anybody, but we all got packed in there and flew to Hawaii. They took on fuel, then we flew to Guam, and then we flew to Manila. And then had to get a cab from Manila down to Subic Bay, which was an experience all in of itself. If you've ever been riding a cab in the Philippines, it was different. Boarded my ship down there, and a little interesting thing is all my life people have called me Jerry because my brother could never say George, my older brother. So I get on the ship, and in the wardroom there's I think 13 officers there, and 6 of them were either Jerome's, Gerard's, Gerald's, or Jerry. So I wasn't Jerry anymore after that, I was George. So that really confused my family when they got around because I answered both ways. But anyway, we spent a lot of time on the gun line doing harassment and interdiction fire and supporting the Marines and the Army and people that were there. We spent a fair amount of time up on the northern section of that, up by Quaviette, where we got taken under fire on 2 different occasions, which was kind of exciting. You know, you don't really expect you're going to get a lot of fire at you, but fortunately we were able to, unlike a couple of destroyers, we didn't get hit and didn't take any damage. So, and we would stay on the gun line typically for 30 to 40 days, and you know, then you'd have to get relieved on the gun line and go back either to Subic Bay or up to Sasebo, Japan for just a little R&R and get the ship repaired and painted and whatever. Of course, while we're online, we would probably once a week we'd do a replenishment at sea for fuel for the ship and food and, you know, fresh food and stuff like that. Our second tour out there, we lost we had 2 main evaporators on the ship, which provided us fresh water. And we lost one, so the one needed to be kept online for the ship's engines and stuff. So we didn't have any fresh water for showers or anything like that. So 77 days at sea without fresh water was a challenge. Every time it rained, you'd see a flood of bare naked people out there with soap just enjoying a freshwater shower. So it was kind of an interesting sidebar. But
How many men on the ship?
we had 273, I believe, on there, enlisted and officers. And one of the interesting facts about when we were over there in 69, we relieved the Evans on station. The Evans was a sister ship. Our hull number was DD 759 and she was DD 754. And the only difference was we had 3 5-inch guns, and she had 3 turrets, and she only had 2. But anyway, we relieved her. She went down and then had the tragedy where she got cut in half by the Melbourne. So that was a little close to home. And then we also got sent up to North Korea when the Pueblo was taken, and again when the E-1B was shot down. So we have 2 tours up into what they consider career expeditionary medal type stuff. And those were kind of interesting because it was really cold and we had to go out and de-ice the ship all the time, because if you get too much ice on those ships, they just roll over. So when you're out there in the cold chipping ice, it's a little bit of a pain in the butt because the spray is still coming all over you and everything. But
Did you have any action while you were in Korea?
no, the scuttlebutt we got was they were thinking of going in and pulling the Pueblo out of the harbor. But that never materialized. But there was 3 destroyers sent up there and an aircraft carrier in case they wanted to do something, which of course with our political situation then and now, they never want to make a decision to do anything that would actually make a good thing happen. But anyway, we just steamed back after a while. And I think the Pueblo's still there. It's the only commissioned ship that's not in our possession. It's still commissioned, and the North Koreans have it tied up as a museum for their great grandeur ability to take basically an unarmed ship out of the water. We spent, I was over there on the ship from December 67 through the middle of 68, and we came back to Long Beach and had to get re-gunned, and then we went back to...
Define re-gunned.
They had the barrels on the 5-inch 38 guns. They get worn out just like a rifle does, and so we had to get new barrels on the mounts, which is quite a bit of work because those things are big and they're heavy. And but we got those. We had to put a whole new mount on, Mount 52. Mount 51 was here. Mount 52 is just behind it under the bridge, and then Mount 53 is on the fantail. And Mount 52 is the gun that gets used the most because you can control it easier and see where everything is. And so we had to replace that whole gun mount, not just the barrels. It was so worn out. And I don't know how many rounds we fired over there, but there's logs somewhere that can tell you there's how many there were. But then we went back over there, back to Vietnam with the 7th Fleet again, and proceeded to do the same types of things, going up and down the coastline and providing support fire. we got pulled down into the Mekong Delta to do a little work down there, and that put us in the brown water, which when we talk about Agent Orange, that made you exposed. Of course, we were exposed out in the blue water as well as that, but whenever they sprayed Agent Orange, you could see it everywhere. It wasn't like it was a big mystery how it got on everything, but fortunately we didn't have any direct impact of Agent Orange on people on our ship until much later. I mean, I didn't realize I had been affected until I was about 4 years ago, so it takes a while to catch up with you. But we were going down to Australia for one of our offline support missions, and of course we got to cross the equator, which is a big deal in the Navy. You know, you go from being a polywog to a shellback, and you got all kinds of, it's kind of like a fraternity initiation you go through. So there were some lighter moments in there too, but it was it's an interesting experience living on a ship with that many people that you didn't know when you first got on, and by the time you got off, you know most of them pretty well, even if they didn't work in your divisions and stuff. So we had, I was in charge of, when I first went on board, I was a first lieutenant, which was in charge of all the bosun mates and what they used to call the deck apes. And then I got moved up to the gunnery officer shortly thereafter, and we were in charge of all the crews that had to actually make the guns work. And we had one guy named Baker who was he was bigger than I was, and probably about 35 pounds heavier. And when you load a 5-inch 38 gun, the barrel's open and you throw a projectile in there and you throw a powder in there, and those things weigh, the powders weigh probably 24 or 25 pounds and the projectiles weigh about 53 pounds. And usually you have a loader for the projectile and a loader for the powder on each gun in there, on each barrel. And he would stand there and do this with his arms and load 2 powders simultaneously. The guy was a brute. And we got all kinds of awards for being fast and accurate, and the reason we were so fast was this guy was unbelievable. So, but we had a lot of young men. It was interesting because being from Vermont, you know, I was not too far away from the coast, so the salt water wasn't unusual to me. But I would say probably 70% of our enlisted personnel were from interior states like Kansas and Nebraska and stuff like that, which always struck me as kind of interesting why they would want to do that, but they did. So it was
Do you think there was a good mix, like East Coast, West Coast, Midwest, North, South, from that perspective?
I think there was a mix. I would say that was heavily in favor of the Midwest states, because it just seemed like most of our officers were East Coast and a couple of them were West Coast, none from Central other than myself. And of course at that time I wasn't from Nebraska, I was from Vermont, but the enlisted crew was, I would say, probably 70% were from interior states like that. And they were just good, hard-working kids, which is what I've learned to expect from them out here. So,
but what I meant was an opportunity for people who really had never left their geographical area to meet people. I mean, it's not like today where with the internet.
Yeah, no, it was a great opportunity for them, and there was a lot of long-term friendships built on that. You could tell on these, you know, the Marines and the Army will tell you that working through the land-based stuff, you know, you build up brotherhoods and stuff, but you did the same thing on the ship. It just wasn't as intense because you weren't under the daily fire, you know, with bullets flying around your head and everything. So, but it got a little hairy when you were doing replenishments and some of the things that happened at sea. We lost 2 sailors off our ship, and one in bad weather, and one was a suicide. He was hung up on drugs, and he just jumped off the fantail, and even though the after lookout saw him go and threw a life ring to him, he was already gone by the time we got the ship turned around, never came up. So, and those unfortunate people don't get listed on as KIAs because they weren't actually killed by somebody in the war zone, but you know, they were still dead. So it was kind of hard to go through that. We had I remember we went into Hong Kong for an R&R stop, and the captain and the supply officer and myself went to a restaurant called Gaddy's, which at that time was a 5-star restaurant, really nice, and our captain liked to eat well. So we went for dinner, and of course it was no. I didn't speak Mandarin, and they didn't speak much English, so I was going to get what I thought was shrimp scampi, and I thought the guy was asking me if I wanted it hot or cold, so I indicated I wanted it hot, which meant it was spicy. So, and it was really good. And then the next morning we got underway, and we got done sea detail, and I was supposed to go on watch up on the bridge, and I went back to my room and just got violently sick, and couldn't make my watch, which of course everybody thought I'd gone out and gotten drunk, and I said no, I was with the captain, so I wasn't drunk. But I was down for, I think, probably 7 weeks, and they finally we only had a second level medic on board, so they brought a doctor over from the carrier, the group we were with, and he came in, and I'd lost, I don't know, like 30, 40 pounds. I was really sick, and he gave me an IV bottle, and it was going in too fast, so he slowed it down, but I ended up taking 4 big bottles of IV solution, and then he took me to the carrier and made me stay over there for 2 or 3 weeks until I could actually get up and walk around. But I had food poisoning as bad as I've ever had it in my life, and it was just, that was an experience I didn't want to go through, but it's what happens to you. So anyway, I got back on the ship, and we had regular duty resumed, and I had to notch my belt up a couple of times because my pants would just keep sliding off, and the old man would say, you need to get new pants. Well, you can't get new pants when you're on a destroyer. They just don't have a place where you can buy clothes. So
no Amazon.
No Amazon. We didn't have any delivery. It was the other thing that, I was still married at that time to my first wife, and mail was incredibly slow. I don't know, you were over there, you probably know how slow mail was, but you could write a letter and it might get there back to the States in 2 or 3 weeks, and my wife was not particularly good at writing response letters, so I might not hear from her for 6 months, and some of that was the mail, and some of that's the fact she just didn't write a lot. So, and then when I was supposed to get out in June of 69, June of 70, that was when my out date was based on my commissioning, and the captain had asked me if I was interested in staying on, and I said yeah, but I really would like to get into a smaller Tucumcari class gunboat. Those were the hydrofoil gunboats, because I wanted a little more, I wanted to be in control of a boat and do that kind of stuff. And he said, there's no chance in hell you're going to get that. And I said, yeah, and then I probably won't re-up. So we got early outs, a bunch of us that were commissioned at that time, and in October of 69, I got mustered out in San Diego, and that was not a great time to be coming back in San Diego as a Vietnam vet, because everything was anti-war, and my wife was out there marching against the war, so we had a few things we had to get through, and we lasted about another year, and then we got divorced simply because we were too far philosophically apart. Had no children, and were still really good friends, but it was just one of those casualties of war that a lot of guys went through with more pain than I went through. But so my experience with the war was basically offshore. We had a couple of times we had to go in country into Da Nang and places like that, because I was the registered publications officer, so we had to go in and get the key cards, because they used the old punch key systems at that point. So they'd fly you in off the carrier, and then it was always exciting flying off a carrier and flying back and landing on a carrier, and then taking the helicopter over, because in those days the helicopters were the Sea Stallions, and they couldn't land on the back of a destroyer. So you go out in the back and stand there, and they drop a hook and a harness for you. And of course the back of the ship's going up and down, and the helicopter's trying to stay steady, so the actual harness is moving all over the place. As soon as you got it on, you give them thumbs up and they fly away. They don't start pulling you up until you're off out over the water in case the thing doesn't work. And then when the winches took you up, it was up to and drop to, and up to and drop to, until they got you up there. So you were sure you were going to end up in the water. Coming back was worse, because they were trying to bring you down on the fantail that was going like this, and you had to almost be like a paratrooper to land and not break your knees. But there was a lot of other ways we transferred. We had to go back and forth between ships sometimes on those chairs that you see with the lines that go across. Those were exciting too. So because the two ships together make a pretty good bow wave that comes up the middle, and it's pretty high, and you couldn't go across without getting soaked. So, but we made it across all the time, so that was good. And I'm trying to think.
Did you ever stay overnight at a on land in Vietnam?
I was in Da Nang for three straight days when they had some hostile fire there, but nothing that I was involved in because I was not, I was a ground soldier. But you could tell that those guys, even though they weren't really dug in like you picture in war books and stuff. They were on alert all the time, and they had perimeter guards all around the base, and they had a lot of their jets and stuff were flying in and out for when they were doing raids and stuff like that. So, and then when I got back to San Diego, I thought I was going to have to stay in the reserves for a while, but they said no, you can be out. So I didn't have an option to really stay in the reserves. I probably would have stayed in the reserves for a while because originally I was going to be a career officer, but after what I saw was going on in Vietnam, I thought I really don't want to be part of this because all the people we supported, they'd come. Sometimes we'd have them back on the ship, and they'd talk about going out and taking a hill, and then on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday they'd fight like hell to get the hill, and then on Friday they'd be called back, and then 2 weeks later they're out taking the same hill, which just defied all the logic of everything you learned in combat training. It was you take territory and you keep it. And of course, as we know, for everything else that's gone on since Vietnam, we have not done a good job of that in our wars. So a little political commentary from one that's very frustrated, but there was, I lost several good friends over there that I went to college with, and they graduated through the Army ROTC program and went over there as second lieutenants, and some of them only made it in like 5 or 6 weeks, and then a lot of them I'm sure had problems with their enlisted troops following, and because they were, the reason I didn't go Army is because they were idiots. So, but it was hard to learn that you lost fraternity brothers and stuff like that over there. So, but when I got out, I joined the Vietnam Veterans Association just simply because I could. I signed up as a life member, but I never went to any meetings or anything because nobody ever said there was a chapter or anything around out there. So when I ended up in Nebraska in 1981, I still wasn't aware that there was a chapter. I was still a member at large. And then I guess it was sometime in the 90s, I found out about the chapter and I joined, and the rest of that is history. But it's been an incredibly great experience to be with vets that have gone through that experience. And well, a lot of them were support vets. They didn't actually go in country and fight, but they were like Richard Luth, who's a dear friend. He was a Marine guy, and he was in Sasebo, Japan, and was part of the supply chain for getting the Marines what they needed to fight the war. And I know we have a lot of people in the country that think that wasn't a Vietnam vet, but they were just as much as the rest of us that went over there and actually took some live rounds. So we've done a lot here with our chapter to bring the message back to people that these were all people that paid a pretty heavy price to be a part of that war, and most of them, obviously all of them came home, but some of them are really sick with Agent Orange now and stuff like that. So I think one of the things when you read this, that we came home from the war, but the war didn't stay there, it came home with us. There's a lot of truth to that, but I'm amazed at how many of these guys aren't bitter. They're not bitter about it. They like to be understood for the fact that it's a price they paid, and most of them would pay it again, and this is what I think keeps most of us active and happy in the chapter, is there's a lot of patriotism, and people feel like the country is still worth fighting for and dying for if you have to, because a lot of the young people today have no concept of what people went through over there, or in any war for that matter, and you've been exposed to this stuff, and it's different when you see it firsthand and when you deal with it firsthand, and it makes you want to teach people things. I'm glad we're doing these type of stories and stuff so that people can at least know somebody's telling them things, what they saw, how they felt. So, like we say, you can leave Vietnam, but Vietnam never leaves you. It's right. It definitely did, and it sent somebody home with you too. So, a little guy called A.O. So,
So when you came back, or I guess I'll say, how did you end up in Nebraska? Did you go from San Diego to Nebraska, or is it a longer story?
Longer story. My wife and I, when I was working in college, I was a food service director assistant for a company called Saga Foods. And when I got out of the service in San Diego, you couldn't find a job, and I needed to stay there for at least another year because my wife was still going to get her master's degree in social work. So I put out my resume to everybody and their dog, and nobody wanted to hire you, particularly if you said you were a Vietnam vet. I would just kind of throw you aside. So I was going through some of my paperwork in my home office, and I found one of my old paychecks from Saga. So I called them up to see if they might have a job, and they did. I got hired on with them and became a food service director at Chapman College. And in the process of doing that, we moved from San Diego up to Laguna Beach, and then I got divorced. And about a year later, I married one of the students at Chapman College, who's now, in August it'll be 50 years we've been married, so we have 2 children and 3 grandchildren, so it didn't work out too bad. So, and then after, she was from Michigan, and her family ran a big company in the material handling, which is conveyors and stuff like that. And long story short, he made me an offer to come back and work for his company, and we really thought a lot about that, whether or not it was a good idea. Anyway, we went back to Michigan, and I worked there for the family business for 9 years, and then decided that I loved the industry, I just didn't like the family business at that point, and they weren't too happy with me because my wife and I were kind of on the outs. So I went to California to work with a friend of mine that had a distributorship out there, and while I was there, some headhunter called me from Ohio and said he wanted me to talk to some guy in Omaha, Nebraska, and I thought, where the hell is Omaha, Nebraska? And so I told the guy I wasn't interested, and I hung up. And he called me right back, and he says, the president of the company is going to call you. Don't hang up on him. And I said, okay. So long story short, he called me and talked to me, and he seemed like a pretty decent guy. And he said, why don't you come in here? This was like a Tuesday. And he said, why don't you come in here tomorrow and talk to me? And I said, well, I can't. I've got a job going here. And he said, well, find out when you can come. So I figured, okay, this guy sounds like a hot dog. So I just booked a flight on Saturday, and I wasn't going to go early in the morning because I didn't want to get up early. And long story short, I said, I can be there about 1 o'clock on Saturday. He says, fine, I'll pick you up. I'll be out front in a yellow Jaguar. And I'm thinking, oh, God. But when I got back, he and I hit it off really well. And long story short, he hired me, and I came back to Omaha. And then my wife and kids were still in Michigan. And about 6 months later, they came down here, and we kind of got everything back together. And we've been here ever since. A great place to raise a family, and you know, we've been plugged into Omaha since 1981. So I feel more of a Nebraskan than I do a Vermonter. But it's, you know, that's the long and story of it, is terms of how I got here from there. And I started my own consulting business, which I'm still active in, and we help design distribution warehouses and with conveyors and stuff like that. We don't sell any equipment, we just do consulting and design. So, and I've done a little bit of work with the chapter, trying to get more people involved in helping with like the memorial that we're doing and stuff like that. It was surprising to me to find out that Nebraska did not have a statewide memorial for the Vietnam vets. Every other state in the country has one, but not Nebraska. So we've rectified that, but boy.
When did you really start the work on the Nebraska Vietnam Veterans?
Tom Brown, we were at a chapter meeting in 2017. I think it was in June. And Tom was talking about the memorials and the fact we didn't have one. And I made the comment, well, we ought to be able to get one going. It can't be that hard. So he said, well, would you help? And I said, sure. So that was the start of it in June of 2017, and they didn't get it actually incorporated as a 501c3 until 2019. So it's been 5 years we've been working on it, and it's almost there. We should have it all complete and done by next Vietnam Veterans Day on the 39th of March, 29th of March, not 39, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's all right.
Try to get more days in there than I can, but, we're right now at about 90% of our fundraising, and so that's if LB 566 comes through, which it's passed and the money's supposedly there. We still don't have the money, but we should have it by the end of May, as I've been told, but we'll take it when we can get it. We've got to deal with Hawkins Construction to do the actual building of the setting of the monuments and everything, and right now we think we'll have the honor wall, which was donated completely by somebody, just the whole cost of the honor wall and the actual work on it, and we think we'll be able to set that in late August or early September. And then the helicopter, the Huey that we're rebuilding, we're going to try and put that in at the same time. An interesting thing there, we're working with the Air National Guard, Nebraska Air National Guard, to get a big Chinook to pick that up and fly it over for us, and that would be quite an interesting thing. If you were in Vietnam and saw the Chinooks working over there, you know how it's incredible what they can lift up, and just seeing that thing being picked up and flown over to our site's going to be kind of impressive. So, but it's I think if you look at that memorial and you take your experiences from Vietnam and you think of a lady like Judy Dershling, her first husband was a Halo pilot and got killed over there. She's from Omaha and has 2 daughters still here, and she's remarried, and I can't tell you what her original married name was, but as soon as she found out this memorial was happening, she called up and she wanted to do something, whatever she could do to help memorialize her first husband. So her name's going to be on one of the plaques that we put with the helicopter. And then she called about 3 weeks ago and she wanted to do more, so she's donating money for a bench in honor of all the Hilo pilots over there. And that's what this is all about, is for those people to have some place to find some closure and remember the people that they lost, that they loved. So, and we've had a lot of those stories come out. As you know, you've been working with Dottie and people on the education committee, and it makes it worthwhile. I'll tell you, it's a labor of love, because I got a full-time job, and this is another full-time job. So, but I don't regret it at all. It makes you proud when you see, like, were you out there for the groundbreaking?
I watched it on Zoom. I couldn't go.
Yeah, it was amazing the number of Vietnam vets that showed up that aren't part of our chapter. We probably had 25 from the chapter there, but there must have been 70 or 80 Vietnam veterans with hats on and stuff there. And then, of course, we had just a lot of people that are interested in it. And the governor was there, and Mayor Black, who's been absolutely wonderful.
Oh yeah, he did a great job.
But yeah, the whole military experience for me was not a bad one. Like I say, I would have been happy to stay on if we'd have been winning wars instead of just walking away from them. But
what do you think you learned in the military, or what do you think is the lasting, or your Vietnam time experience?
Big thing for me was I was pretty much of a butthead. I don't like to be told what to do, and of course when you get in the service you get told what to do a lot. And once you learn the reason for having that kind of discipline, it carries over into life itself, because in combat you need to be able to depend on that person, whoever the person is behind you, whether you're on a ship or whether you're out on land. And life is no different. You know, you've got to learn to depend on people and trust people. And we've lost that now in this country, and that's really, I think, is too bad, because, you know, there's no other place for us to go if America goes away. There's no other democracy that you can run to and have what you've got here in this country. So I learned a lot in terms of respecting people, which was, when you're a hothead young man, you don't necessarily have a lot of respect because you know everything, you know. And you learn over time that you don't know very much, and there's a lot of people around that know more than you do, whether they're higher in rank or lower in rank, or higher in the social status or lower in the social status. It doesn't matter. Everybody's got something to offer, and you can learn from everybody unless you're an idiot. And I was an idiot for a long time, I'll tell you. So, but no, that's the biggest take I took out of the military was respecting people that were above you because you had to, and respecting people that were below you because you needed them. And that was a balance that life has been it's been that way ever since I got out of the service. And when I was running the food service for colleges, we had a lot of college kids working for us and a lot of food service workers, which weren't the highest pay grade in the world, but they were wonderful people and they worked hard and they raised their families, and you had to give them all the respect for that. Not everybody could be the manager, and not everybody wanted to be the manager. And I certainly couldn't do half the jobs that those people did. You'd try to get me to make salads, that was going to be a disaster for everybody. But it was, that was the biggest lesson, was just to value the people that you're around. So.
Do you ever go to any reunions from your naval?
We've never had one. The ship got decommissioned and sold off for scrap, I think. And we had a association kind of like the Evans Association for, I don't know, about 10 years, and they corresponded and stuff like that, but they never had a reunion per se. I haven't been to any reunions at all until I started going to the state reunions here in Nebraska for the Vietnam vets.
So nothing, say, like from your training, your Naval Reserve, I don't want to say it wrong, from college, that group?
No.
Okay.
No, that was...
Any Facebook pages?
Well, I do. We've got the Vietnam vet page. There's several of them on there. I'm on the one that's called for Tin Can Sailors, but those are mostly people I don't know.
Okay.
But there's one guy on there that publishes almost every day what various ships were and what actions on that day. So it's kind of fun to see their ship was actually recorded as being there. So the Navy guys are, I think they're probably not as reunion oriented as, say, a Marine Corps or an Army group, because they weren't on the ground together all the time. But it's interesting, because I was pretty close with a lot of the people on the ship, and I stayed in touch with them after we got out. But then, of course, one goes to Chicago, one goes to Louisiana, somebody goes here, somebody goes there, and you just kind of lose track of them. And there was a few of them I didn't care if I kept up with, to be honest with you. That always happens too. But it was, reunions were not a big thing for our group, I'll just put it that way. So.
Part of the question. And then, have you ever spoken about your Vietnam military experience with your second wife or your children, grandchildren?
Very little.
Have they asked?
Well, it's interesting. My wife and I took our two grandchildren, our two boys, before, when they were younger. They're both in their 20s now, and my granddaughter is just turning 8, so she wasn't around then. But we went to Dover to a NASCAR race, because I'm a big race fan, and then we went to Washington, D.C. to show them the monuments and everything. And my youngest grandson, who was just 4.5, maybe 5 at that time, we walked, of course, through the Vietnam Memorial and, explained what it was and everything. And then when you come out, there's a couple areas you can go to. They've got little stalls that you can buy memorabilia from and stuff. So we were looking at some stuff there. And my young grandson named Ashton, you could see him, he was contemplating things in his head, and then finally he looked up at me and he said, "Grandpa, are you dead?" Because, we just talked about all these people that were dead on the Vietnam Wall. And I explained to him no, and then, of course, as he's gotten older, my youngest grandson has somewhat been interested. My current wife has, since I've gotten involved with the chapter here, she's become more questioned. My kids have not spent a lot of time asking me about it, because, it's not a lot, like most people, it's not something you just want to sit down and talk about every night. So it's not that I had such traumatic experiences, but as you get older and you realize the people that you worked with and the people that you grew up with that went over there and died, then it becomes a little more traumatic, because, I remember one of my best friends on the ship was an officer named Tom Lang, and he was married to an admiral's daughter. And the admiral wanted him to get off the Black Shoe Navy and get into the Brown Shoe Navy. So when he...
What's the difference?
The naval air versus the Black Shoe is the water, and the Brown Shoe is the air.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
At least that's what we referred to it as. And anyway, he went to Pensacola and went through flight school, and he got his carrier qualifications done. He came back to San Diego right after I got out of the service. and he and his wife stayed with us for a little while because they were looking to get housing and everything. And then he was killed in a training accident on Miramar Naval Air Station. And so, you know, he's not a casualty of the war, but technically he was training to go back as a pilot, and he'd been there, and you know, it was hard for that. And I had another real good friend who was in the EOD with me, and he came home and was home probably about 7 years, and he committed suicide. So it's just, you don't know how it's going to turn out. And I remember when Tom died, I was shaving my face that morning, and it came to me that Tom was never going to shave his face again. And those are the kind of things you think about when you think about losing your friends over there or in related accidents. And so I've always worn a dog tag ever since I came back from Vietnam, and I put it on every morning, and it's just a reminder that I'm doing okay. So, and I feel that way. I'm very blessed that life has done what it's done for me. And I know there's 58,000 plus guys there would trade every one of my worst days for another chance at it. So it's a meaningful thing to look back on it, but it's sometimes difficult too, you know.
But then I guess, did our generation ask our fathers and some mothers what they did in World War II? I certainly didn't.
Well, I was the first one in my family, except for my uncle. My mother's sister's husband was in the Korean War. We didn't have anybody in the military prior to that, and he was badly wounded and was a POW over there. And they had a VA hospital in White River Junction where we lived, and they sent him up there to rehab. He lost his arm, and we didn't talk about the war that much, but we talked about how he rehabbed his arm and what his time was like as a POW. And he was, I was fairly small then, fairly young, so it was, you know, pretty impressed with these things. And he told us that, you know, they used to cut each other's hair and stuff because that's what you had to do. And they were doing that one day, and they got ambushed. And the guy he was cutting his hair got killed, and he got his arm pretty well shot off with a machine gun. Then they all got taken prisoner, and he said it was like 6 or 7 weeks before he got any Red Cross or anybody to help him with his arm. They cut off his arm because it was just hanging by skin, so the guys took a knife and cut it off. But in order to get water to clean it, the guys would get a potato I think every day they got a potato, and they'd squeeze the potato juice out because it was sterile or clean, and they'd wash out his arm for him. And then finally the Red Cross got in there and they got him stitched up, but he damn near died. But that, he didn't talk about the actual fighting or anything. That was just the experience he remembered, which is pretty traumatic. So, and then if you follow most of the guys that came out, John McCain, I knew John McCain pretty well when I worked in Washington, and you sit down and have dinner with John McCain and his friends, and he didn't talk about the war either. And that man got brutalized over there, as a bunch of them did. But they were all damn proud Americans, I'll say that. So, you know, I don't know anybody that's actually been in combat that feels like it's a topic they want to just go out and talk about, you know, because it's very traumatic when bullets are flying at you and you think, you know, I really could die here. So I remember our very first incoming rounds were on Christmas Day in 1967, and I'm thinking, it's Christmas Day, who fights on Christmas? But you know, different world. So but no, I don't have a lot to say about it anymore. I know when you first come back, people keep asking a lot of questions about it, and I never knew what to say because I never felt like I was into it as much as the guys that were on the ground, you know, even though technically we were. But those guys that went out, I mean, like Tom Brown, who you know very well, was a Marine forward observer, and Howard Ball, those guys were out there taking direct fire almost every day they were out there. So I always felt like I was removed from that a little bit, except when a couple of times we got taken under fire, but it wasn't the same. You know, we were remotely fired at. We weren't next door getting shot at. So, and I think a lot of guys feel the same way. In fact, there's a whole group of in-country combat vets that don't even want to talk to you if you weren't in country. So, and they're entitled to that opinion as far as I'm concerned, because they were the ones that were paying the ultimate price. And they did. I think we only lost maybe 3 sailors from enemy fire directly on Navy ships. A couple of them got hit and blew up gun mounts and stuff, and there'd be 2 or 3 guys killed in those, but that was a rarity. So you were much more removed from it than somebody that was getting pounded on every day. But you know, the respect that you get from people that like Tom, that if you've been in it and done it and come back and try and help the rest of them, then the respect stays there. It is truly a brotherhood or a sisterhood in the case of, we don't have a lot of the women that came out of that conflict.
It's a different time. I mean,
Yeah.
Women, if they were in the military, they were very limited where they could be.
That's true.
And it was not, my perspective, a welcoming military.
No, back then, of course, on the ships we didn't have, it was all men, there were no women.
It was a different world.
Although I will tell you, having grown up a lot since I was in the service, I think we should have more women in leadership roles in the military, because women think differently than men do. There's a great book written by a friend of mine on that, in fact, same subject. It's very true, because they do. They listen differently and they think differently, and we don't get it right all the time as men because we're too damn competitive and too hot-headed. So I've been working with a female partner for 35 years, and I would not be where I am today without her, because she just doesn't take any BS from me. She'll say, I don't agree with you, and we sit down and talk things through, which is what you want. And when I was on the board of the National Small Business Association in Washington, there's a group called NABO, which is the National Association of Women Business Owners, and we had several of them on joint cross boards, and they were incredibly smart women. I just could not tell you how I was just shocked. You know, and that sounds terrible, but you know, as a typical macho male chauvinist pig as I was at the time, you just don't think women have that to offer, but they do. And you're right, during our war, there weren't a lot of positions for them, but I wish there had been, because I think we could have had a different outcome in a lot of cases. So it's just like now they got this woman that's the first woman commander of a aircraft carrier, and I think that ship is going to do incredibly well under her. I really do, because she'll be no nonsense, but she'll be a caring person, which most of the guys that skippered big ships weren't that caring. They were just very much do it because I said so.
Yeah. Well, we frown on caring men as part of the problem, and this is so off track, but no. Anything else you want to add?
No, I think I'm really glad you guys are doing what you're doing. I think it's, you know, I hope you get a lot better stories than mine. Mine are pretty...
Every story is a good story, has something to add, okay?
Yep. Well,